Okay, so as you know, we've been in a series called At the Table, and there's a lovely table set up behind me to help represent that. And so today we wanted to do something different and kind of create maybe hopefully a bit more of a at the table atmosphere by the two of us being up here sitting down, having a fake conversation-ish. We've each taken a word or a topic, and we're just going to talk about that. So there's 5 of those. And with this whole idea of at the table, it's sort of, it's got a whole depth of meaning, because the table definitely represents our tables at home, with our family and our friends and, all those kinds of things. But the table for us, as we've been talking about this series, also represents the different contexts we find ourselves in. So whether that's our church community, and so if you imagine this room being us at the table, or the fact that we live in Woodinville or Washington or whatever city in this massive metropolis you live in, that being your table or your workspace or your friend group that doesn't go to church, and even in a larger context like America and some of the divides that exist in our nation right now. How do we sit at the table with our neighbors, with our people that we don't know, with the strangers, with the people who wander in? What does at the table mean? And so hopefully we're going to expand on some of those as we talk today. But really to take this concept and this idea as more than just the table at home in your own homes, but in your whole lives. How do we apply all of what we're talking about in this series? Okay, so the first word that I had to talk about, or that I was given to talk about, is fellowship. And so when I was originally first thinking about the word fellowship, I immediately went to, in a house with friends, showing up early, cooking dinner together, laughing, joking, the smells of food and camaraderie and, maybe some cheese and grapes to start out with, and then, steak or meat of some kind. And, that's what I think of when I think of fellowship. Those are some of my happiest memories with my friends, were times around food. And then when you got to the table and you started talking and you just would sit for hours. One of my friends was really good at yelling at whoever went to go start the dishes, because the fellowship was the important part. The dishes could wait. He was German, so he was quite direct about it. And so as I was thinking about fellowship and thinking about talking about it, I'm like, that's a pretty standard human experience around food, around talking with each other. And so what is there to talk about fellowship, especially in a context that we talk about fellowship in church so often? And so what does that mean? Are we just supposed to have each other over for dinner and leave the dishes until the end? And so as I was thinking about it, I remembered one of the Greek words or the Greek word that's used for fellowship. And it's koinonia or koine, whatever. It's koinonia for me. Ask one of the Greek scholars in the room what it's actually supposed to sound like. But in most things I've found that our Christian word usually doesn't have as much meaning or as depth in our modern post Shakespearean English world. But when you go to the Greek word, it's actually it's full of depth and full of meaning. And the basics of it is pretty much the same. It's sharing and giving and that sense of community. But one of the contexts that it's found in is in Acts. So in Acts 2, right, at the beginning of Acts 2, Holy Spirit comes, everything changes, 3,000 people get saved that day. Peter's in the streets preaching, days after he was denying Christ, just crazy stuff is happening. And at the end of that, Peter finishes his speech up, and then in verse 41 it says, "So then those who had received his word and were baptized, and on that day there were added about 3,000 persons. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the shared participation, or koinonia, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers." And so this idea of koinonia in the Bible, and I think in general, is an action word. It's this idea that, they were sharing food, they were sharing bread, no one was going hungry. Everything was communally everyone else's. Which sounds like a really good idea or a really good, moral thing that we're supposed to do. But that act of koinonia is that act of sharing what is yours. That act of koinonia is teaching and learning together. That act of koinonia is going to daily prayers, as they would at the time. That act of koinonia is sitting with each other in the hard things, when someone passes away. And, that friend doesn't need you to tell them everything's going to be okay. They just need you to sit there. Or they need you to pray over that thing that you've been praying for over and over again. Or that kid who's no longer following Jesus. But you need someone to pray with you continually, even though you're not seeing breakthrough, but to stand with you in that. So koinonia, this idea of fellowship, is the sharing of life as a whole. Not just the good moments, not just the moments where, that are set aside, but getting in each other's lives. And that act of stepping outside of oneself. So, that's me. Your turn.
The next, I guess it's 2 words, is sacred space. And as I was sitting on this phrase, or these 2 words, the first thing that came to mind is that really the operative word in this is space. Because there's, like Mackenzie was saying about fellowship, there's an assumed action, I think, or maybe there isn't, it's not assumed, but I see this as an action, that space is being made. There's movement in it. But for what? Like, why make space? And I think there's a lot of different ways we can answer this in the context of being at the table, being in fellowship together. But the thing that is coming to mind is actually similar really to what you were sharing about fellowship, which is that we make space so that our humanity can be held together in community. Our mess, the depth, the good, the bad, the ugly. Space is required for us to bear one another's burdens. And I think in relationship and community, it is so easy, especially in the culture we live in, to kind of coast on like a shallow level. And there have been many times in community where I really don't feel like making space. Because whether it feels like an inconvenience or it would take too much of my own energy, there are many times where I'm like, oh, Lord, I just don't feel like making space for this person right now. It's also how I'm wired. I tend to not like, I'm going to take up space and talk and be whatever, assertive. And because being human is messy and vulnerable, it's a lot easier for me to kind of sit and hold myself in my own space, reserved, in my own strength, and not be like, hey, I'm not doing well, I have needs, and to be willing to take up my own space. I don't know how many of you that's difficult for, but that's really hard for me. One of the ways that I feel most loved is when someone stops and is like, hey, I want to hear how you're actually doing. Isabella actually texted me the other day and was like, honest check-in, like, how are you doing? And I feel more loved from that kind of space being made than most other things in my life. And so there's 2 movements. There's me making space for other people and choosing to move beyond an inconvenience and to say, you know what, this is worth it. And then there's the movement of my choice of saying, I'm going to take up space. I'm going to believe that I'm worthy enough for the space that is being welcomed to me. And so the verse that came to mind as I was sitting on this was in Matthew 25, where it says, then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then these righteous ones will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will say, 'I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you are doing it to me.'" And that, I think, is the sacred part of this phrase. That's what makes space at the table sacred. That when we do it for each other, we're doing it for the Lord. That when we treat others as if they were Jesus, when we make space for them that way, that is when it becomes holy and different. And I can imagine some phrases getting added onto that Matthew chapter. I was grieving, and you sat and held me. I was celebrating, and you celebrated with me. I needed your attention, and you set down your schedule to be with me. At the really brief story, at the holidays, my parents and grandparents have made it a huge deal my whole life to make sure we have extra space. There were many years where total strangers showed up at Christmas or Thanksgiving that they met at church or at a coffee shop or on the street. And we treated them as Christ. They were welcome into our home. We ate with them. And another practice we did, and I remember thinking it was really silly then, was leaving a seat open for Jesus. And as a kid, I was like, that's stupid. Why would we do that? And as I was thinking about it this morning, because I never really resolved that thought process. As a kid, I was like, oh, that's dumb, and then never thought of it again. But what the Lord said to me this morning was that both of those open invites to the table are the same. That what my parents did in making space for people to come to the table to sit with us and leaving a seat open for Jesus are the same practice. It's making sacred space at the table for people to come, and we treat them as Jesus. We would treat them like Christ, just the way we would treat Christ as if he were sitting at our table. So.
That's awesome. So now I get to talk about honor. And for me, honor is something actually really exciting to talk about because growing up, I hated the concept of honor. It actually really bothered me, primarily because, and I've noticed this is a common theme, is that I saw what the older generation saw as honor, and what they were trying to force me to be in that context as distant and far off and arbitrary rules that I didn't really understand, that didn't have any meaning to me. And between that and some other things that relationships with some older people that were difficult, I kind of became frustrated and had a distance with this concept of honor and what that meant. And it actually took a 73-year-old South African woman, mentor of mine, walking with me and sharing with me her journey with honor. And so with honor, the Hebrew is to give weight to something, to give literally weight, and to value something, to put effort into something or someone. And so as I've journeyed with this concept of honor, and been to different cultures and seen how other people do things, I've come to realize that the ways that we honor each other are often not arbitrary, but subjective. And that's okay. And this is something that I try to convey to people in my generation, especially in interacting with people older than us, is honoring is almost a different way of saying loving, of that self-sacrifice of giving to someone else, of choosing to say, this is not my way of doing something. This is not how I would respond to you. This is not how I would think about this. This is not how I naturally would in my pride or whatever, respond to you. But, and for me, with the older generation, I can say, actually, no, I want to show love to you by using some of the traditions and the ways that you were raised, whether that's, with my, before I proposed to my wife, I had to ask her father. But when I first met both of them, her parents, I had to say Mr. and Mrs. And for me, that was totally foreign. I didn't grow up. I think I called my teachers Mr. and Mrs., but in Iowa, that just wasn't really a thing. And so for me, it was like, what is this? They're going to be my in-laws, whatever. But it was a way to honor them. It was a way to put aside my own caring and to say, actually, I'm going to choose to see you in that way. And very quickly, they, said use their first names. So, but this concept of honor often ends up a huge tension point in relationships, because the way that we feel honored is another way of saying the way we feel cared. And so, if unbeknownst to me, I act in a way that dishonors, say Alex. Alex and I are from different homes, different families. We have a different way of thinking about things, looking at things, personality, all of those things. And so something that I could do could be dishonoring or not caring about him in that specific way. And that can easily create distance and tension unless we talk about it. And this is in that asking, in that seeking, in that figuring out what the other person finds in honor, we learn a way to love them. And so for honor, it's about this love, this sacrificing of the way that I would do something, and this stepping towards and seeking out someone else. And so what finally broke through from hearing the story of the 73-year-old South African woman was the way in which she chose to go outside of her own way of honoring to honor the younger generation. She works with primarily 20-something-year-olds. And the amount of sacrifice that she's given of her own way of doing things to reach into the lives of people like me broke me in that way. It tore down every wall of bitterness, of resentment, of being misunderstood. Just hearing how she had gone out of her way to learn to honor the younger generation. And so there's for me in honor, in love, in seeking out the other person, it creates a space where we get past all the walls. Because honor is so intrinsic to the culture, to the values, to where you grew up, that when we learn to honor someone the way that they can be honored, not necessarily the way that we learn to be honored, it takes those guards down. It creates a familiarity. It says to them, I've taken the time, I've taken the effort, I've stepped forward. I'm stepping out in vulnerability to meet you. And so when we're talking about at the table in the context of honor, it's not just our table at home, not just our table here at the church, but our table even in the context of politics, in the context of different denominations, or all the things that can be so divisive in the world around us. If we choose to start from a place of honor and that inquisitive stepping towards someone, we remove those walls that have been built up because of social media and all those things that create such divides, and we can actually see the person as a person. It's just, there's nothing like it. And one really funny, weird example of honor. So on one of the schools, we had someone from Korea and we had someone from Sweden. And in Sweden, if you're at the dinner table, it's actually more polite not to interrupt the person talking and to just reach over their plate and grab whatever condiment you're going for, right? So like, just reach across their face, grab it, and come back. Because they don't want to interrupt you when you're talking. That would be rude. For us, and especially for this Korean girl, that was totally unacceptable. Like, super offensive, should never have happened. And she actually got quite angry and frustrated, and they had to talk about it afterwards. But even these small things, these little like at the dinner table manners that we learned, whether that was don't put your elbows on the table or, whatever that happened to be, those little things when we're inquisitive can convey honor. They can convey respect. They can convey love. So that's the beauty of honor.
That's so good. The next one we get to talk about is reconciliation. And you're like holding on to your seat, like, I don't want to talk about this. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. So if my voice cracks at some point, I'm sorry. This is a topic I could talk about forever. I have a bachelor's degree in reconciliation and conflict resolution. And so I promise I'll try to keep this short. But the Lord has just been so clear in my life about my call to conflict resolution and reconciliation. And I think primarily because it's one of the topics that the church, especially the American church, has a really hard time with. So it's a little bit uncomfortable. Growing up in the church, I was not taught how to deal with conflict. It just really wasn't a topic of conversation or teaching. Luckily, I grew up in a family with parents who prioritized conflict resolution so much. My mom would make my sisters and I stand toe-to-toe in the bathtub and like look at each other and like apologize until it got so humorous that we just couldn't like be mad at each other anymore. And then when we got older, it was a bit more intense of like actually learning how to resolve conflict with differing opinions or hurt feelings or whatever. And so I learned through growing up, and I think being forced to resolve conflict in friendships in high school, that I really have this belief system that it is such a deep part of what it means to follow Jesus. My favorite chapter of the Bible, actually, I don't know why it is, maybe because I like conflict so much. It's 2 Corinthians 5, and it lays out what it means to be ministers of reconciliation. So I'm going to read a few verses from this. So if you want to turn to that in your Bible, feel free. It won't be up on the screen. It says this: "For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses or sins against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us." And essentially what this is saying, in a lot of verbose language, is Jesus died for all of us, and because of that, the old has gone and the new has come. Therefore, we are called to treat each other like the new is being made manifested or realized in us. We are not marked by our old selves anymore when we are in Christ. We are reconciled back to Jesus. And so then Jesus says, okay, you're reconciled to me, and I'm handing you this ministry of reconciliation. Would you be reconciled to each other? And so where there is a schism, where there is conflict or fight or disagreement or hurt, whatever words you want to use for conflict, we are to remember that we are called to be ministers of reconciliation. It's not a choice. It's not just something for me because I have a degree in it. It is something that we are all called to as people who have been reconciled to Christ. We are called to come back together, to restore, to work through the stuff. There will never be one time that we are not called to be ministers of reconciliation. And there have been plenty of times in my life where I have tried, where I've said, you know what, let's have a conversation. Can we please try to work through this? We're not understanding each other. And the other party wouldn't engage. They refused to see that the old had gone and the new had come in me, and those relationships ended. And so I'm not saying it's perfect every time. I've lost relationships. But I obeyed the call to try and to restore. Does that make sense? And again, I think this process it's the old has gone in me, it's passed away, and the new is being made realized. Or looking at someone and saying, okay, I see that the old is gone in you because you're reconciled to Christ, and I trust that the new, because of your relationship with Jesus, is being made realized in you, that you are being transformed from glory to glory to look more like Jesus, and I have to choose to believe that about you. I want to share a testimony about this really quick, and I have her permission to share this, so don't worry that I'm just like spilling secrets. And Alyssa, are you in here? She's over there. Alyssa and I, our friendship is it is my favorite testimony of reconciliation. If you know both of us, you know that we are very different people. And when we started connecting a few years ago, we butted heads a lot. We hurt each other's feelings all the time. It was messy, and both of us were in a really intense season of being transformed by the Lord. We've both changed a ton in the last few years, and one of the primary ways that the Lord did that was through our friendship. And so there were a lot of hard moments and a lot of moments of choosing, like, okay, we're committed to reconciliation. But I remember one, this was a few years ago, we were sitting over here in the worship center. No one else was in here. It's during the week. And I don't have any memory of why we were not well in our relationship. But we were sitting in here and kind of feeling stuck. Like, man, I don't know how the heck we're going to be friends. Like, this just feels impossible. And I remember telling her, like, look, I'm not going anywhere. I love you. I'm committed to reconciliation. I'm committed to this relationship. And something shifted in that moment where we looked at each other and we were like, we have no idea how this is going to be restored. We do not know, like, how in the world the Lord is going to bring friendship out of this, or if we'll get past this. But we made a commitment, and we said, you know what? We're committed to reconciliation. And without Jesus, like, I don't think that could have happened. If she or I hadn't been as surrendered to the Lord transforming us as we were, we wouldn't have the beautiful, amazing friendship that we have now, and she feels like family to me. We could not have done it without the Lord, because he's the one that transforms ultimately. But I had to choose to say, you know what, I'm committed to you. I'm not going anywhere. And the analogy that we used around that time was software updates in our relationship, which is brilliant. It was her idea. It was brilliant. And honestly, I was thinking about it, and I was like, man, this is really similar to the old has gone, the new has come concept that we read in 2 Corinthians 5. That there were moments where I was tempted to forget the work that God had done in her, where I was tempted to forget that the old has gone, she's been transformed, she's not dealing with that thing anymore. And I didn't choose to say, look, the new is being made realized in you. And the same for me, like, and so we called it software updates of like, hey, software update your understanding of me. Like, the new is being made realized in me. Would you please choose to see this? And so I could keep talking about this for so long, but that is a testimony of a friendship where we chose reconciliation and we fought hard through some stuff. And I, like, the way that I've seen the Lord's faithfulness, the way she has extended grace to me, where we're so different, but the way the Lord brought us together, and now we get to do ministry together, and we're family. It is one of the most, it's just the most special thing. And so just an encouragement, like if you're in relationships where you feel like there is no hope, maybe it's a commitment to software updates, to say like, look, I'm being transformed. I'm not perfect. The new is being made realized in me. But can we commit to this? Whether that's in your family or your marriage or a coworker or whatever that looks like, that one, we're called to this. We're called to reconciliation. And it is really not as hard as we make it out to be, because it truly is as simple as like, Lord, do the work in me. Would you transform me? Would you get this thing out of me? And I'm going to choose to trust you're doing that in somebody else. Because without reconciliation, like, everything just explodes and people leave and there's hurt feelings and grudges and unforgiveness and bitterness that gets held onto for years and years and years. And that is not the Lord's heart for us. It just isn't. But we get to choose to be ministers of reconciliation.
That's awesome. And a side note, each one of these things that we've been talking about, these are conversations that we're having as a staff. These are conversations we're having as a leadership team when the staff meets with the GC. And these are things that we're talking about for the whole church, of how do we cultivate these things? How do we grow these things? And this staff, and I want to honor Kiernan and these guys, this staff team, when I came in, had already been doing so much work in fellowship, so much work in honor, in reconciliation. The relationships that you see functioning so well in this church are because these guys have chosen over and over and over again to prefer one another, to love one another, to not give up on the others. Yeah. So the last one I get to talk about is humility. And humility is a fun one for me because it can be so deceiving in some ways in our culture. Someone, actually Rachel at Louderback now, who used to be here, redhead, she would tell me that humility is neither thinking too highly of yourself, but also on the flip side, not thinking too lowly of yourself. That false humility actually is another form of pride. And so when we're talking about humility, and in general, I think there's a concept in the Bible that we've sometimes missed, or at least I did, maybe I'm the only one, that these words or these concepts or ideas are all things that we fight in our head. But in actuality, they're actions. You know, the Bible says do not be afraid, but that doesn't mean don't have fear in your head, because it's a biological process designed to help keep you from doing stupid things that will get you killed. Like, there's healthy responses for a reason. So what does do not be afraid mean? It means don't act in fear. Follow the Lord regardless. Fear the Lord above all things. And so when we talk about humility or love, love is another one. I like saying this. Jesus in the Gospels never says, I love you. It's always a past tense, I have loved, but he never says, I love you. For Jesus, love is not a word you say, it's an action you perform. It's something you do on behalf of someone else. And so with humility is not just a mindset or a word, but it's how we act towards other people, right? And often, for me at least, humility in the context of leadership is one of the easiest ways for me to think about it and to kind of grasp hold of it, right? And so if you have a leader, who's been in ministry, let's say, because that's my context, in ministry for the last 50 years, right? They've been doing it. They've done all the things they shouldn't have done. They've learned from their mistakes. Like, they're really solid. They've got it figured out. The reality of their humility in the way they think about themselves is they are really good at what they do. They could do it better than most people in any room that they find themselves in, right? But when it comes to raising up the next generation of leaders, humility for that probably makes them close to 70 or 80 at that point. That the humility for that 70 or 80-year-old is actually to say, no, you go, you try. You know, I'll be here, I'll answer questions, I'll support you, I'll stand to the side. Not because they think anything less of themselves, not because they're in their limelight or, whatever nonsense we come up for older people retiring. But it's that person choosing to stand beside someone else, to prefer them, to honor them, to, all these things that we've talked about. And even to then help clean up their mess, to not leave them when they've mucked it up, and there's a huge mess and there's paint all over the place. Paint being proverbial, saying things about other people or hurting other people. All those kind of things that can happen in life, in ministry, and in programs. Where the program ends up late because the new manager hasn't done a good enough job keeping the time scale right, or the new driver hasn't kept the schedule correctly. But that person is learning. And so in humility, that boss, that manager, that 40 years experienced pastor can stand beside the other person and help them to grow, to learn, and help them clean up their mess. And for me, that's what I see in Jesus over and over again. Not only did God decide to lay aside everything and come down into earthly, miserable flesh as a baby, as all those things, but then he died and he lives victorious now, and he was resurrected and victory. But he chooses to work through us. And not just once does he forgive us, but over and over again, as we're learning and as we're growing, he chooses to say, no, I committed to you. I'll help you clean this up. I'll help you change. You can't do it yourself. I'll help you do it. We're literally incapable of reaching the standards that Jesus wants us to reach. And so he's constantly in that mode of servitude and honoring, moving towards us and committed to us. And so really, it's not a concept in our heads of how we think about ourselves, but it's how we act towards the people around us, how we respond to people's mistakes, how we respond to interacting with people who are lower than us or higher than us socially, or all of those things. It's our response.
Yeah, kind of on this, I'm remembering a time where the Lord really convicted me, and he said something along the lines of, pride and insecurity are two sides of the same coin. That insecurity is still a pride issue. Pride is still an insecurity issue. And so that question of okay, I mess up. I say the wrong thing. I have the choice to respond in pride, to say I didn't mess up. I did nothing wrong. They shouldn't have their feelings hurt. What's wrong with them? Or I choose to go the other direction and be I'm the worst. I'm never going to figure it out. I suck. I'm never going to amount to anything. And there's those two options, which are thought processes, and they're also choices. And so to say okay, I mess up. What is my choice here? Because pride and insecurity could be two sides of the same coin. Am I going to choose pride or insecurity, or am I going to choose to say, you know what, I don't have it all figured out, but I'm learning, I'm trying, I'm sorry, and let's move on. And that was something that's been really helpful, because I would get stuck in Is this a pride issue or am I just insecure? And the Lord's like, well, what if it's the same thing? Like you're making it too complicated. Worship team, if you want to come on up, we're going to continue in worship this morning. We don't have a slide with all 5 words, but if you have a good memory, they're fellowship, sacred space, honor, reconciliation, and humility. And I think as we respond, would you ask the Lord, which of those 5 do you want to talk to me about this morning? Is there a relationship that is a mess that you want me to reconcile? Am I struggling with honor? Am I refusing to engage in fellowship? Am I engaging in relationships in a way that is not making space for people because they feel inconvenient to me? Do you want to talk to me about a pride issue? And to ask the Lord those questions as we respond. And my encouragement, like, if there is a response that the Lord is asking you, like to go and reconcile to that person, or to apologize, or to invite somebody over for dinner, would you do that this morning? It doesn't have to be simple, or it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be simple. It also might be complicated. I don't know your lives. But to choose to respond, like all of these words we've been talking about have been active. They require movement. And so if the Lord's putting something on your heart to move, my encouragement is to obey him, because he has something so much better in store for you when you choose to say yes to him. And so I'm going to pray. Feel free to stand, to move around the room, whatever that looks like. Jesus, thank you that you were the perfect imitation of these things, that you are a high priest who is not unable to sympathize with our weakness, that you get it. You've been there. Thank you that you modeled fellowship, that you made space, that you honored, that you reconciled. You called us to a ministry of reconciliation, that you were the perfect example of humility. Lord, would you move in this room? We surrender to you. Would you make it less about us and more about you this morning, Lord? I speak permission over this room, permission to be messy, to get it wrong. Thank you that you are gracious and forgiving, Lord. Would you speak to us clearly this morning? We love you.